Sametrica has actually been around for 4 years. We rebranded about a year ago. And since we founded the company, we actually went from a consulting company to a software as a service company. So that was really interesting. And there was a huge learning process that went into that. We had domain knowledge, but we were able to kind of shift the business model as we needed to. As a CEO, it's actually been a really interesting process for me because, as you may notice, I am female. I'm also a visible minority. And generally speaking, CEOs don't really fit that mold. So it's been a process. However, what I've also noticed is that even though my demographics might not fit what a CEO might do or what an entrepreneur might do, I think there's actually something common amongst entrepreneurs and people who work in startups, which is that we notice something different about ourselves and we see how things are, and we look at the status quo and we say it's not good enough, and so we build a product that fills that gap. That is essentially, I think, what an entrepreneur does, and anyone who chooses to work in a startup. So we actually worked, how do I get this started? We actually started working a few years ago, as I mentioned. But for me, it was actually a really important question about how do we build diversity in teams? Because I saw in myself that there was an ability to notice a gap. And really the gap we noticed was that the government spends about $30 billion a year on social investments. They spend about 10% of that monitoring the impact of those investments, and yet they can't come up with a really meaningful statement about what that $30 billion actually means. If you're funding homelessness or whatever, what does that mean to be able to give people permanent housing? We can talk about that in qualitative terms, but there's no numbers, there's no actual reporting. And so having noticed that as an entrepreneur that doesn't fit the demographic mold, I thought, well, why don't we build more diverse teams, and why don't we invest in a diverse team as a company to be able to continue to coming up with these insights and building the product that would meet the market requirement. The other thing that was actually really interesting for me was thinking about how the workplace has changed. I don't know, just a show of hands if you've heard of Reza Satchu or the Next 36 at all. Okay, a few of you. So I actually happened to be in Reza Satchu's class. And this slide should show two people at work, which it does not, but those are the general graphics. But in any case, it was really interesting to me because I was thinking about Reza Satchu and his company Storage Now. It sold for over $100 million. And Reza Satchu was actually talking about how he came up with that idea. And what he said was he was driving his parents home from the airport, and he noticed that there was no longer a need to have these storage units, these large storage companies outside the airport, because young people or people with higher affluence didn't want to have to drive out to the airport area in order to store their stuff. They wanted to be able to do that inside the city, and that's where the Storage Now idea came to fruition. It was actually deciding to put these storage units directly into dense urban areas so that people, probably like a lot of people in this room, when you're moving kind of apartments, you could essentially decide to move into a storage unit in Storage Now, just at King and Bathurst, for example, and then move to your own home. And so this idea of work and family as being separate doesn't actually make sense for the creative individual, and doesn't make sense for creative individuals who are working in entrepreneurship, because the ideas that we come up with are so very close to what we do. When you're an entrepreneur, you really believe in the idea, and you think about it all the time. And in fact, the best kind of, what we call single unit hires in entrepreneurship are similar. They don't go home at 5 p.m. and stop thinking about your business. In fact, they come in at 9 a.m. or 8:30, or in some cases 8 a.m. I'm not a morning person, so you can imagine how upsetting that is for me. But sometimes an employee comes up to me at 8 in the morning and says, I've had a really great idea, and I would actually like to make a change to the business or the business process. It's amazing how much, process innovation can have, what the impact of that can have on your business. But the reality that I came to is that if we don't have diversity of experience and if we don't have diverse teams, we can't actually create the type of disruptive change that we'd like to within our company. And so just kind of coming from my perspective, I thought, okay, well, what about males versus females in the workforce? If we have generally speaking, the startup space is kind of dominated by males. What does it look like for females who are working in the same space? It turns out that both males and females are actually working a lot more than they used to. So you'll notice from this slide, we've got paid versus unpaid work. Males are kind of working a little bit more, females are working a little bit less. Is that like a, okay. And so generally what we're seeing is that regardless, we're working a lot more. And so for females, the diversity of that experience is not as high. They're not actually working as much in terms of the paid economy. The issue with this, however, is that there's a lot of uncaptured value. And so what we could do as a company is really start looking at diversity in a broader sense. We have this, however, when you look at cultural disharmony and more males than females working in the workspace, what we actually find is that it doesn't always work out so well. So there's something called ambient cultural disharmony. Basically, it means if you have a whole bunch of people from diverse backgrounds who are all working in the same space, they tend to not get along very well. That's kind of interesting because when you look at the other research, we know that S&P 1500 firms that actually have more females on their board tend to actually make much higher profit. When you really dig into that, though, so you have this idea of cultural disharmony and people not really getting along if they're not from the same demographic space, but at the same time with very large firms or very high growth firms, we see that they actually do make a lot more money. This is kind of two pieces of data that tells us it doesn't quite work out. The interesting thing is actually being able to invest in innovation. So it's not just about getting more people who might look different from you and putting them into the same firm. It's actually about investing in innovation and having this as part of your culture. So I'm actually just going to put this out there, but I think diversity in and of itself is not good enough. What we need to do is have diversity lead to innovation. We as companies need to hire for diversity and then also have a culture of innovation in our companies. The last piece about profit is actually profit is kind of a lagging variable. It only happens kind of the next quarter. If you screw it up in Q1, you'll see it in Q2. So if we as companies really think of ourselves more as villages, as communities, there's an opportunity out there to actually look at diversity as driving innovation, which will eventually drive to profit. But it's not just that simple. We can't just hire for greater diversity. It has to be a little bit of both. So just to kind of wrap up here, when we look at the leading profitable companies, again, kind of drawing from a whole bunch of research, we know that if you are diverse, you also must invest in innovation in order to work out well. You need to have overlapping expertise within your companies. You can't just have people who work in silos. You need to have clear goals that come out of that and then kind of a decentralized communication network. The idea here is that people tend to only hang out with the people that look or talk like them. To really have diversity work, investing in innovation means forcing people to talk to someone who they might not want to hang out and have a beer with, but would actually have a lot of expertise for them that can help them build a lot of value within your company. So it really does come down to looking at the end product. And this is actually focusing on these four things has been what's led us to have 19% month-over-month recurring revenue growth. It's the thing that has allowed us to have a very broad range, probably an all-female kind of executive team, but continue to really show the growth that really matters to our investors. Questions?
Look at that, front row. Okay, I love this idea of kind of investing in innovation. Where I sit running an educational program for startups, teaching people how to start up and teaching companies how to start up, it's kind of key to what we do. But I wonder if you have any examples that are top of mind for how people, either clients that you guys have worked with or other people that you've used for research purposes or whatever, are investing in innovation, and how, if there's any examples top of mind that have driven profit somehow.
So this might sound crazy, but the government of Canada which doesn't sound like a group that would invest in innovation, in fact is. So one of the things that they've really been doing is, oh God, this is embarrassing. So one of the things that we've been doing is coming up with, essentially we can track the investments that happen over billions of dollars of investments. These groups are able to come together and actually start talking about the learnings that are happening across different fund recipients. But in terms of investing in innovation, they're able to actually like fly in nonprofits that they're working with to talk about what's working and what's not. So, for example, if you're dealing with seniors with social isolation, what are the best practices that are coming from that? I think innovation is twofold. It's one, sharing best practices, and two, actually being able to take the risk to find out what's working and what's not. That's an example.
As you're growing, have you found a way to kind of have balance between maintaining a diverse culture and then just getting new talent in? So, because if you're growing at 19% per year, like you want to make sure that you're getting the right talent in there. Do you find any issues with access to talent if you're continuing to try and push that mold between having a balance between everything, basically? Yeah.
Did I say 19%?
You may have
Hello? Oh, okay. 19% per month. So I think that's really the case, right? You have to either decide if you're going to invest or not invest, and if when you invest, that's the risk. So for us, we haven't had to make that trade-off, if that makes sense. It's like we've decided that diversity is going to lead to innovation, which is going to lead to profit. So us all of our processes are built out around that. So we haven't, as of yet, had to make any kind of trade-off around that.
in terms of getting new talent too?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Well, because that's the messaging of the company.
Okay.